Welcome back, everyone, to Speaking of Art. I'm your host, Edwin Hoffman, treating you to our wonderful guest, author, singer, and comedian David Misch, whose new work, Funny, the book Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Comedy, published by Applause Cinema and Theater Books, is a breezy, hilarious, and reflective history of what makes us laugh with or at, and how we communicate it. David Misch has enjoyed a 40-year career as a comedy folk singer, Somerville, which you just heard, a screenwriter for Mork and Mindy, co-writer of Leave It to Dave, Dave Letterman's talk show debut, creator and writer of a multitude of network and cable TV shows, executive producer of Duckman, the groundbreaking Emmy-nominated animated series, which also won the Cable Ace and the Banff Awards, executive story editor for Police Squad, co-writer and producer of Callahan, guest writer on Saturday Night Live, and numerous other projects. You can follow Dave's blog also on the Huffington Post, and here to guide us into the delightful fretwork of comedy is David Misch. Welcome, David, to Speaking of Art.
Thank you very much, and thank you for playing that. That's going to be my first residuals in 30 years.
Well, just send me the bill.
That is the stamp is going to wipe out my profits. So.
Wait, I love that song, and it's just in the audience. I mean, clearly, we're just following along with this, and you've really hit all the facets in comedy, and what better person to write a book like this? Funny, the book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Comedy. It would seem like a suicide mission for an author to try to encapsulate comedy, but you do it in such a deft way, and you reveal the serious side, which you have to have, I guess, that makes comedy work through the millennia.
Well, serious in the sense that I like to take comedy seriously and think other people should too, and I think the fact that it gives us such obvious pleasure. Comedy is the only art form where your reaction is, as definitive. I mean, you can feel sad or contemplative, disturbed, unhappy, even frightened, without necessarily emitting a specific sound. But in comedy, everyone knows what's going on. And maybe because of that, people dismiss it, because the laughter is such a straightforward thing. But I think comedy has a lot more to it than that, and I try to explore all those different facets in the book.
Well, David, you said that very, very well. And, one thing, that, we've heard, about futurists are famous for saying that technology changes, people don't. You've studied comedy through the ages, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the graffiti writers of Pompeii. What are the few or the seemingly requisite attributes of successful comedy to what you've been able to distill down?
Well, the principles of comedy, which certainly don't change. People talk about does comedy change, and it doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't in that its basic principles don't, but it does in the way those things are expressed. I mean, for instance, there are more bodily fluids flying around the comedy big screen now than there were in the 1920s, and there's more references to body parts on television situation comedies than there were in the I Love Lucy days. But the basic things where those expressions are coming from always remain the same, and basically they can be boiled down to tension and resolution and surprise. But one of the things I kind of discovered for myself, at least in researching this book, is that there's almost nothing you can say about comedy's principles that you can't apply to any other art form's principles. Tension and resolution applies in music and in dramatic art and painting and anything. So basically, the reason we laugh at something as opposed to cry is sort of a mystery.
You bring up a very, very good point, because there's a whole area of entertainment in film that never gets an Academy Award, and correct me if I'm wrong, and those are the great comedic actors.
Well, never is an overstatement, but far too seldom. No question.
Far too. I mean, Cary Grant, not that he was a comedian, but nobody did it more deftly than he, balancing the comedic in a drama, otherwise a drama. And never got an actual Academy Award, except at the end of his career, a special Academy Award, I think in 1969 or something.
It's very rare that comedy is rewarded on the award scene. I haven't memorized this, so I can't say, but the last one that comes to mind is Kevin Kline won as the Best Supporting Actor for A Fish Called Wanda in the 80s.
Yes.
And back in 1934, It Happened One Night was the first movie to sweep all the Academy Awards. and it was a comedy and a great one that still holds up. But since then, very seldom, and I was very disappointed last year that Bridesmaids didn't do better. I thought that was a brilliant movie, and I think she got
You are
Best
absolutely
Screenplay.
right.
But I thought Kristen Wiig should have been up for an actress award. She just did a fantastic job, I thought.
Yeah, just to talk about her, I mean, here is someone that whenever she was in many, many scenes on Saturday Night Live for her, 5-year run, or actually, no, I think more, 7 years, right? On SNL. Every time she was in a skit, it was almost like you could hear a pin drop. There's just something, a huge star quality about her, that she could do it all. She could be in ensemble, or she could be the main character in a skit, and she's got that kind of gravitas. So I totally agree with you. That comedy does not get the appreciation really that it should get as a serious art form. We kind of we think we know the reasons for that. Did you discover anything in your research for your book, Funny, that brought this out maybe a little bit more boldly?
Well, let me go back one step, though, just to reinforce what you're saying. I think people think the process of comedy is nothing but laughs. And look, I won't lie to you. I've been in the writer's room at sitcoms, and we do have a lot of fun. But we don't just have a lot of fun, and we're in those rooms for 8, 10, 12, 14 hours a day. There's a lot of laughs, but not so many over the course of 14 hours. If you divide it, it's 2 laughs an hour. Mostly we're working really hard, struggling to come up with something that will be funny, and mostly because we've experienced a lot of comedy, we will hear something funny and we'll all nod and say, yes, that's funny. We won't actually laugh because we're well beyond that. But it reminds me of the Python members, Monty Python people would would always come up to them and say, "Oh man, you must have been so stoned when you did that." and what do you guys just make it up as you go along? And they would become quite incensed because these are very serious people. They would sweat blood. And I've worked with other people. You sometimes have huge fights over the most tiny things, the number of syllables in a word, the placement of a word in a sentence, and specific words. I have a chapter in Funny the book about the rules of comedy, and one of them is that the words that end with a hard sound, like a K or a P, are funnier than words that end with a soft sound. So duck is funnier than fish, as an example.
Well, what a heritage, David. I mean, one really has to have a hero complex, I think, to do that one-on-one with an audience and to put everything out there. Yeah. And you always remember when it goes flat. And to be able to learn from that, to get the timing down right, it is as intellectual as any kind of science that I can think of. And I've got to say, with your book, Funny, the book, everything you always want to know about comedy, and then others that people and have worked with and appreciate their work, Jerry Seinfeld, for instance, who've also intellectualized comedy in recent years. I have to say I've always liked that approach, the appreciation of ensemble acting, that coming from vaudeville, and then the great soloists and stuff. We can mention some of those. There seems to be a little bit more of an appreciation on what makes good comedy, what makes it work, like we talk about what makes good design with the Elton feature that I have every week that played a few minutes ago, or we talk about art generally in other ways on the show.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, I hope that's true. I still think too many people just think comedy comes. You're funny, so funny things come out. But, and certainly that's true at times, as it is in any art form. Sometimes you just get inspired. But one of my favorite quotes, which is almost certainly apocryphal, is that someone asked Stravinsky how much he worked every day. And he said, I work, 8, 10 hours. And they said, you're inspired that much? And he says, no, but I want to be there when inspiration strikes. And that's how it is for most working artists. You put in the time, and then sometimes you get lucky, and it's not lucky because you've done the work.
I'm so glad that you said that, because in one way or the other, it echoes. I've been very fortunate to interview several authors in succession, and to be able to, have you here today also, and then to hear that message. You just don't, arrive with a smile, when inspiration hits. You're there. And you just sort of get it out. Now, I know we only have a minute before we go to the bottom of the hour. I just want to ask you a quick question. Do you find that there is a real relation between being a writer of comedy and being a performer? If one is the writer, does it stand that they will also be good, say, in stand-up or at other types of media venues? Are they sort of separate disciplines, or what's the synergy or not in that combination?
Well, let's put it this way. I used to be a stand-up comedian, and now I'm not.
I know.
I think that the two are related, certainly, but and Woody Allen was a comedy writer for many years before he tried stand-up, and when he first did it, he was horrible. That's in the book, too. And he only gradually got better.
Bob Hope and everything, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The transition is possible, but it's like any other transition in any other artistic field. It turns out you either got it or you don't, and people who persevere and succeed do not necessarily outnumber the ones who persevere and fail.
Ladies and gentlemen, our wonderful guest, David Misch, comedian and author of Funny, the book, everything you always wanted to know about comedy. We're going to be speaking with him again when we get back from break. You're listening to Speaking of Art. I am your host, Edwin Hoffman, and I'm not trying to be funny, but we will be back in just a few minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to Speaking of Art. I am your host, Edwin Hoffman, and that music is far too serious for our subject now. Forgive that, but we have a wonderful guest, David Misch, comedian, author, 40-year career in comedy and entertainment. His latest book, Funny, the book, everything you always wanted to know about comedy, published through Applause Cinema and Theater Books. You can get it online. Go to the bookstores. It is there. It has so many write-ups. For instance, just let me say what Carl Reiner said. I love that David Misch wrote the perfect bedside book. You can refer to it anytime you want to smile before you go to sleep. And the great Jason Alexander, it takes a serious mind to analyze comedy. It takes a funny mind to appreciate it. David Misch is of two minds. David, welcome back to Speaking of Art.
My pleasure.
Boy, that is very, very high praise for icons of the comedy world. And what a great tour de force going through the whole history of comedy. What the formula, if there is one, the great names. It's just wonderful. Now, in a lot of the interviews that you've done, one of your major themes in the book is the idea of the trickster. Sort of like the destabilizer of social situations. And that really kind of hit home to me. And I thought, from your description, we were all tricksters and destabilizers as kids. What is it about, great comedy that is it reuniting us with our young pasts or what?
Well, yeah, it's a very perceptive comment. I think trickster is very much related to children, and I think there's a little trickster in all of us, and that's why we relate to it. But I should explain to those few people who haven't bought the book what trickster is. He's a mythological character, and what's fascinating to me is that he appears in every single culture ever recorded, some form of trickster. Trickster is not a name any culture uses. They all have different names. Anansi in West Africa. We had our own Brer Rabbit in the Uncle Remus stories here, and there's a million of them, Krishna in India. But basically, they all are troublemakers, button pushers, people who upend society through a myriad of methods, duping and insulting the powerful, con games, practical jokes, but most of all through language, playing with words, which is, of course, a major attribute of comedians. Puns, double entendres, malapropisms, tongue twisters, oxymorons. And all through history, they are people who flout society's rules or expectations, turning the normal situation upside down. Whenever a bum becomes rich, a man dresses like a woman, an adult acts like a kid, that's a trickster idea, and it tends to be a movie plot.
They're kind of like escape valves, aren't they? For all the pressures that would ossify us and lock us in, they're kind of like a little bit of hope that things could change.
They're fantasy figures for us. We all wish we could do those things. Sometimes we do. More often we don't. But in watching trickster do these things, and sometimes they get away with them and sometimes they don't, but just the idea that you can do those sort of things is liberating. And one example I use in movies that most people can relate to is the Marx Brothers.
Oh,
who,
my gosh,
did
yes.
these outrage. But, pretty much any comedian, Will Ferrell in most of his movies, they're always doing these outrageous things that we kind of wish we could do. Larry David in Curb Your Enthusiasm, the perfect trickster. He's also relatively malevolent. He's not likable in the conventional sense, and yet people love him because he represents that freedom.
He definitely is one of those jesters saved from Shakespeare's histories. And you mentioned Falstaff and Puck, of course, from Midsummer Night's Dream, and Falstaff from the Henry series by Shakespeare. I would put in a literary to go in the literary vein, Dickens's Wilkins Micawber, for instance.
Sure.
Also, a trend that I've seen in recent years. seems, and tell me if I'm going in the right direction with this, but it seems that what we consider sort of old-time slapstick comedy, the Marx Brothers, situations that very, very suddenly spill into the ridiculous. We see that coming again today with like Will Ferrell, for instance, or Steve Carell and others, that tumbling from point A to point B in a disastrous comedic way seems to be making a comeback. I mean, is that right?
You will certainly there. I'm not sure how much it ever disappeared, but there's trends in comedy like in anything else, and Judd Apatow with his movies of sort of men-child, who are all trickster figures in the way they embody childhood and refusal to kowtow out of society's conventions.
Right.
Those were all the rage for a number of years. They still are to some degree. Steve Carell generally represents a smarter kind of comedy. Doesn't mean it doesn't use the same principles. Will Ferrell is again more in the slapstick realm. He's more the classic clown. And one of the things the book traces is how these figures go back so far in history. The first stand-up comedian was essentially the court jester.
That's absolutely right. That's the only one really allowed to say, pull the robe of the potentate, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And, recently in the last few weeks, it started with Don Rickles about a month ago, and then a week ago, Daniel Tosh stepped into it saying things that went over the line, and because having written one book, I am now the expert on comedy. A few people come to me and say, so what do you think about, stepping over the line in comedy? And the whole point of comedy is to step over the line. The difference is that you're either good or you're bad. In the immortal movie, This Is Spinal Tap, one of the guys says, there's a fine line between stupid and clever. And the fact is, you try something that's over the line, and it may be stupid and it may be clever. If it's stupid, we say, boo on you. That's stupid. We're not going to listen to you anymore. If it's clever, we say that's a really good point, even if it's outrageous. So people like Rickles have been doing it for 50 years, and once in a while they do bad things, and other times they do great things. That's the way of comedy. It's part of the price of free speech.
Don Rickles could be the subject of our conversation for the whole interview, couldn't he? Or Bob Hope. That's very, very well said. Ladies and gentlemen, David Misch, author and comedian, his wonderful book, Funny, the Book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Comedy. David, it seems to me, looking back, that pushing the line and crossing the line really comes to the fore with Lenny Bruce and All in the Family. The great stand-up comedian.
In the 50s and 60s, Bruce was fighting against the conventions of the 50s, and then the 60s, Norman Lear was pushing everything forward with All in the Family.
And, ever since that time, it's de rigueur now to push beyond the borders to the point now where I wonder whether or not something is being lost, and I could be completely wrong with this, but I remember one of the crux of George Orwell in 1984 and also his other books too was if you reduce language, you actually reduce thought. So if you actually don't have a population who really think of a word anymore, they actually lose the emotion. Now, other people have told me, anthropologists and stuff, that's not actually linguists, that's not actually true. But it seems that we've gone so far with comedy that the language has taken on a persona of its own, and it seems to be a reductive type of experience. Are we, something that relies so much on language, as you admit, are we in danger of maybe going too far now?
Well, again, I am a pure First Amendment guy. There's no such thing for me as going too far. There's only people who say stupid, offensive things, which they are allowed to say. But the real question in going too far to me is, as a comedic professional, which is we look at things and we say, it's not that that's stupid or offensive, it's just not good. It wasn't well crafted. And you have shows now, sitcoms on TV who use the word vagina as a punchline. Well, the first time it was used, it was not familiar, and that was pretty shocking and funny. Now it's like, oh, please, it's just a crutch. And it really gets me to one of the seminal figures in stand-up comedy. I deal with 3 stand-ups in the book, Woody Allen, Steve Martin, and Richard Pryor, because I felt each of them changed the face of stand-up comedy. But the interesting thing about Pryor is that he's remembered, I think, even now, primarily as a dirty comic and as someone who did all this racial stuff. And a number of his admirers, like Eddie Murphy, took that as what his legacy was and went further with it. But they, in my opinion, missed the real issue with Richard Pryor, which was vulnerability. Never before, and I'm not even sure since, has there been a comedian who opened himself up to such a degree, who admitted his horrific failures, who dwelled on his heart attack, his drug problems, his problems with women, and opened himself up in a way that just made you cry as much as it did laugh. And that, to me, was how he changed comedy forever.
I think, and he brought in some incredibly serious things. I remember in one of his comedy routines after his accident in the 80s, and you'll remember it right away, when he all of a sudden turned to the audience and said, you know, the N-word is used among African Americans way too often, and we've got to stop it. And he was actually making a plea for that. In other words, we're talking about dignity. We're laughing, of course, here and stuff, but the whole effort, the shoulders we stand on of civil rights, we're undermining it all the time. We've got to eradicate that thought, that word, and everything. And I thought that was one of the most eloquent things that he just went off, on a tangent with. And I just wish that we could recall that more.
Well, you know what was so fascinating was that was a 180 on Richard's part. He was the one who essentially introduced it to the language of stand-up comedy. And when he did it, it was outrageous and shocking, and everyone laughed and gasped at the same time. But he had a very specific meaning for that word. He was using it not as a sort of, obviously not as a racial epithet. He was using it to describe a certain underclass of black people who were despised not only by whites but by blacks, that they were the drug addicts, the hopeless alcoholics, the people living as bums. And he wanted us to understand that they were human beings. And he used that word to help draw us in comedically, but then he showed us what they were like. And then, after going to Africa and, growing a bit himself, he decided it was a horrible word and it could only hurt, and he stopped using it and urged everyone else to, too.
Very well said. David Misch, our wonderful guest today, his book, Funny, the book, Everything You Wanted to Know About Comedy, out in Applause Cinema and theater books everywhere now. Maybe he was able to get away with it, David, and you described that, in a very moving way, maybe because it was something that you put a lot of emphasis in, the personality of the joke teller, that it all turns on that. Like if you have great lines but the wrong messenger, so to speak, it really does fail, doesn't it?
Go to your TV set, to take a transcript of some comic on Comedy Central, then tell that to your friend. Do the whole routine to your friend and see what kind of reaction it gets. The fact is that good lines don't alone make a comedian. It's personality. What I mentioned in the book is that really one of the first people, in the early days of stand-up comedy, which was essentially vaudeville monologists, as they were called, they took ethnic stereotypes as to get their humor. So they'd be Irish, they'd be Catholic, they'd be Jewish. In fact, the Marx Brothers, who grew up in vaudeville, they were all ethnic stereotypes in their early days. And Chico actually maintained the Italian stereotype all through the movies. But when Bob Hope came along, he was one of the first people to have, as a personality, not an ethnicity, but his own self. He was a smart-alecky, fast-talking, cowardly, wisecracking, smug guy,
amorous kind of
women,
fellow,
never getting them. Yeah. And that persona helped make his jokes come alive.
And that is fascinating. And it begs the question, is the stand-up comedian, or the comedian we see in other venues, is he an everyman, or is he kind of apart from us, a sort of summarizer of our lives?
Again, if you take any art form, and anyone who makes a movie or a painting or a symphony and attempts to encapsulate all of human experience is going to come off as pretentious and stupid. The only way to encapsulate everything is to zoom in on one small thing. I'm me. But if I'm any kind of me, the experiences I have and the thoughts I have, you're going to be able to relate to in some way. I go back to Larry David. This is not a person anyone would want to aspire to, his persona on Curb Your Enthusiasm. He's a horrible person. He's self-entitled, obnoxious, pushy. But we all have that within us. We have that inside us. We recognize it. We're not proud of it, but it's there. And so he becomes an everyman.
Very well said. Very well said. Ladies and gentlemen, David Misch, author, Funny, the book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Comedy, just out here on Speaking of Art. Going back to Bob Hope just for a moment, David, a great mentor. I mean, God knows a lot of people wrote for him and then had careers later on. Was he approachable? Was he someone who sort of truly sort of like headed a school, so to speak, of comedy, or what was it like?
As near as I know, and I did not meet the man, but I know people who did, but as near as I can tell, he was a great mentor, not in a sort of conscious mentoring sense, but in the sense that any smart person can learn from someone else. I mean, Larry Gelbart was one of his writers, and he ended up being one of the great comedy writers of the latter half of the 20th century. He he created the TV series MASH, and A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, many other things. But anyway, he, like all of them, you rapidly learn what works and doesn't work. Because I don't know if Bob Hope would say, here's why this joke doesn't work. He'd say, that doesn't work. But gradually you put these things together, and you learn how to craft something that'll please him. And since he was a comedic expert, you learn how comedy works.
And it seems to go like today we have the pseudo news shows, Colbert, Jon Stewart, and whatnot. Is that the way people really want to get information? It seems that is a very successful formula where the humor really has a legitimate place. It's not all, some droning anchor. I mean, you've got somebody who's he's playing with your sense of reality and perception, and maybe arriving at a higher truth. I don't know. What do you say about the infiltration of comedy in sort of unexpected venues today?
Well, you talk about, do people really want to get their information that way? And there have been surveys showing that many, significant percentage of young people get their news from The Daily Show, which is an avowedly fake news show. What they do is not news, and yet people get their news from it. So how can that be? First of all, Jon Stewart has said he's horrified by that. He says you should read newspapers, that this is not how you should get your information. But it reminds me of my daughter when she was young. I loved The Onion, the satirical newspaper, and they did a terrific book called Our Dumb Century, which has 100 front pages of their mythical newspaper going through every year of American history from 1900 to 2000. And she loved it. She thought it was hilarious. But in order to enjoy it, you had to know what they were making fun of. So if she read a story about the Hindenburg, she'd say, Daddy, what's the Hindenburg? And she learned American history through the fake history of The Onion. So in that way, humor can help people learn. And in fact, there's all sorts of examples of how humor, for instance, the great Jewish sages always opened their lessons with a joke, because it helps focus the mind and it helps pull in the audience. It
universalizes things, doesn't it? And legitimizes multitudinous emotions, I think. I remember 9/11, people like Jay Leno and the others, is it time yet? Is it time yet to joke? Even to mention 9/11 and something, and now with the horrible shooting in Colorado, I mean, it is a natural reaction to disaster, isn't it? Not necessarily bad taste. It's something that is biological with us.
Sigmund Freud, there's been great arguments ever since Plato and Aristotle about the uses of humor. Plato and Aristotle thought laughing was inherently wrong because it indicated that you thought you were laughing at the misfortunes of others, and therefore you were immoral just for laughing. But as time went on, people began to have a more nuanced view of humor, and Freud said that one of the ways in which it helped us was it was therapeutic. It's a coping mechanism, and never does that come out more than with disasters like this. People make jokes almost right away after some horrible thing happens, and you think that's heartless, that's cruel, that's grotesque. But it's in fact a way to deal with tragedy. It's a way to move on from tragedy. It's a way to put it in perspective. I remember after the Challenger disaster, I got a call within a half hour of the ship exploding, and someone said, "You know what NASA stands for? Need another 7 astronauts." And I couldn't believe this had happened within a half hour of this horrible thing while we're all still sitting around in shock. But a friend of mine who was a reporter said he heard that joke and he laughed, and just that laughing helped him distance himself from feelings which would have crippled his ability to do his job. He had just been sitting in shock, and with that laughter, it was like permission to move forward, which we ultimately have to do.
It's funny that you say that, because as you were describing that at the end, I was thinking I was coming back from the country the other day in the evening, and out in a sparsely populated part of Michigan, coming back to Ann Arbor, and every now and then I'd see a house. Some of them, relatively small houses with fields around them and all that, very separated one from the other. But you'd see the glow of the television coming through the blinds in these different houses, or you'd see the screen itself through a window. And, I'm here, by now I'm a voyeur looking at this phenomenon and how necessary what you just said in those individual houses, because it's one of the only things that we could actually say we've got a network holding us together. And the humor is doing it, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's you can be immobilized with terror or with fear, and one way to move past that is humor. Stephen Colbert said, "If you're laughing, I defy you to be afraid." And that's one reason all dictators ban satire. They know how dangerous it is.
Boy, that is a beautiful point, a very chilling point. Ladies and gentlemen, David Misch, wonderful writer, his book, Funny, the Book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Comedy. You've got to get this book. It is a history of comedy. It's kind of like a recipe book of how we are, really. And it just is, certain things just don't change. The human capacity for humor and to mock his own life and the hindrances in our lives, it all comes through in David's book. David, I wrote down a list I have here on the desk in front of me of certain, comedians by name, and I just wanted to get your comments on this. And what I did was I broke it down. I have ensemble comedians and then the soloists. Let me just go through the ensemble group because it's much shorter than the other. I lead off with, and many of these are featured in your book to quite an extent, but just wanted to mention them. Marx Brothers, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, Seinfeld, of course, even Penn and Teller, and then I drifted off.
Well, there's Monty Python. Don't leave that out.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, how could I forget that? But you meet people all the time who never really got it. It's kind of neat.
Absolutely.
It's like a night and day thing. It's like Seinfeld in its early days. People either liked it or they hated it. There was really no middle ground, was there?
No, and that's one of the things. One of the points I make about comedy, which is that my book is not about what is funny. It's about funny is what. It's trying to explain what humor is. But the fact is, no one can say what is funny because it's different for every person. And there's a quote in the book from Shakespeare, "A jest's prosperity lies in the ear of him that hears it, never in the tongue of him that makes it." And that means our ears, our brains are what makes comedy. It isn't the comedian who makes it. It's us who have to figure it out. And in fact, Steve Martin kind of based his, and he's someone who's many people did not get as a stand-up, but he based his whole stand-up career on the concept that comedy was not some rhythmic thing that you could just mechanically put out and get people to laugh at, but it had to be something that people would have to work actively to understand. So he would do things that weren't obviously humor. They only became humor when contextualized and understood by the audience.
Like common memories reheated, so to speak.
Yeah.
The best, and the common, experiences that we all have. Not that you're hearing it for the first time, but somehow deep inside, that comedian was able to resurrect it in some way, or the writer was able to find it again.
Yeah.
Isn't that incredible? Now, this is the list, David, of the soloists, in no real order. Bob Hope, Will Rogers, Milton Berle, Lenny Bruce, George Carlin, Andrew Dice Clay, Jerry Seinfeld, Richard Pryor, Eddie Murphy, Johnny Carson, Jay Leno, David Letterman, Ellen DeGeneres, Robin Williams, Steve Martin, Billy Crystal, and John Belushi. By no means complete at all. Those were just the ones that came into my mind in about 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. Every one of them a master of timing and the value of the word and of saying nothing. And I'm wondering, is that something that, in you being a professional, is that something that is trainable in a person, or is it a natural sense? Because it seems that successful comedy rests on the fulcrum of that kind of timing.
Like most yes or no questions, the answer is somewhere in between. You can train comedians, you can train comedy writers, but you cannot make someone who is not funny. What you can do is take someone who has some natural talents and natural instincts and help them learn what the general principles of that discipline are and use that to hone their comedy to a higher level.
Very well said. Very well said. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest, David Misch, comedian. We're talking about his new book, Funny, the Book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Comedy, which is out, published by Applause Cinema and Theater Books. It is a wonderful read and reveals so much about us, revealed about you. David, boy, I'll tell you,
you put it. Do that.
You put, you put it out there in your career. Just everything you've done from the writing and the importance of language and literature in your background, writing and founding these shows, being an executive producer, being a stand-up yourself, being this comedic folk singer. Every way you could express yourself, you seem to do it. What's next on the horizon for you now with the book? You're going to be coming to the Ann Arbor area, by the way?
I don't think so. I'm actually doing a miniature book tour in the fall, mostly in November, but I don't think Ann Arbor has been booked. So anyone out there who wants to book me, give me a call. But as far as the future, I'm looking for Funny the sequel. Beyond that, I have a play opening in the winter out here, which is actually something I wrote when I was about 25 and have rewritten, hopefully better. And I'm excited about that, my first play. And then I'm working on a TV pilot with some producers right now, so we'll see how that goes. And doing some teaching, so keeping busy.
I could almost see this as kind of like a series itself in some kind of variations, the book. I mean, it's so fertile, just incredible. May I ask you one more question, quickly before you go? Often when we think about comedy, it's almost like seeing a weather report on television. It seems like the only rain, the only weather is coming on the map in the United States or in your state. It doesn't go anywhere else in the world. Is good comedy coming out of, say, Asia, or are they adapting, our comedy, Western comedy in general? Do they have their own? Can we expect, even higher standards and excitement, going down the road?
We're all captives of our culture to some degree, and I confess I am, but I have tried to pay attention to comedy in other cultures. I couldn't put it in the book. It's 200 pages. I have a paragraph for Bob Hope, so that's how I had to condense everything. But there's fascinating things in other cultures, and I mention in the book there's a Chinese tradition called crosstalk, which is essentially rapid-fire banter, which is essentially Abbott and Costello, who's on first. So there are echoes of what we consider our humor in all sorts of cultures.
Well, that very, very well said. David, thank you so much for joining me on Speaking of Art.
My pleasure.
Your book, Funny, the book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Comedy by David Misch, out right now. I want to thank you for your time joining me on a Sunday, and also Harlan Bowl, your representative, who's always a pleasure to work with, and these wonderful interviews coming from him, and I thoroughly enjoyed this, as did my audience. Thank you, David, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, join me again next week for more Speaking of Art. I'm your host, Edwin Hoffman, here at WHAM. Have a prosperous, artful, and humorous week.